just when we thought he couldn't get any worse. If you thought the eugenicist right couldn't say anything more pointless and purely contrarian than they already did, get a load of this crap. I swear, the only reason they're making these videos at this point is just to make themselves stand out from what people might think could be conflated with them. Well folks, find a way to offset the IQ points you're gonna lose, because today, ubersoy is here to try and fail to attempt to debunk the labor theory of value, all while making himself look like a completely incoherent dumbass in the process. And when it comes to practice, ubersoy's absurd logic doesn't bode well, because he debated Marxist economist Victor Marinho, and that was the most brutal beatdown of an anti-socialist I've seen this year. Let's watch.
Hi, I've decided to record this video after a couple of people had contacted me on Discord and asked me how they best could argue against the labor theory of value. So this video is for them and for every other person who doesn't know how to argue against it. So consider it to be some sort of a tutorial, but before understanding how to argue against it, it is crucial to understand what it is that you're arguing against in the first place. And in the minds of the socialists, the labor theory of value is understood as the capitalist stealing the surplus gain from selling a product, thereby stealing it from the worker to which it supposedly belongs.
That's not what the labor theory of value is in and of itself, because the definition you just gave only explains how surplus value is siphoned from the workers. The labor theory of value, which wasn't called that by Marx by the way, posits that the value of a good or service is determined by the perceived adequacy of the labor required to produce it. For instance, if I see a pen in the store and I choose to buy it, I feel that the labor put into making this product is adequate enough to where the product will serve me a utility. That's what Marx means by socially necessary labor required to produce something. Only 37 seconds in, and the high IQ is already conflating his terms. Goes to show the fastidiousness at which he researched.
That is, of course, if we assume three fundamental things. The value of labor can be measured objectively through an equation, and it will equate the constant capital of materials used to produce a product and the amount of hourly labor by the worker to the final price of the product. In other words, if the wage of the worker equals to $20 and the price of materials and other expenses is equal to $10 and the capitalist had sold the final product for $40, the worker is owed an extra $10 while the contribution of the capitalist is simply ignored.
There are multiple things wrong with this refutation, with the first being the irrelevancy of whether value is quote-unquote objective or not, whatever the hell that means. Marx consistently argued that value was determined subjectively. Second, this isn't a very pluralistic of an equation substantiating the LTV, so I'm gonna let the man of the hour explain it himself, and link the paper he cites in the description of the video. And I'm glad you mentioned the contribution of the capitalist apparently being ignored, because this brings us to one of the fundamental tenets of Marxism. The fact that capitalists can use their investment as a rationale for siphoning nearly every cent of profits from the worker. If business structure was cooperated, each and every one of the workers would have their labor also be their investment equally.
An assumption ignores other external factors such as workers' benefits, experience, cost of investment, risks, and other various financial operations which determine the wage of the worker, and finally,
Yet again, we think the way business is structured so the capitalists can use their investment to justify siphoning profits away from the workers is based on an entirely arbitrary precedent. Stop defending people that are marginalizing quite literally everyone just so they can make their stock look more attractive, and get real.
Third assumption is that whatever product that is sold was sold in such a manner that a surplus value could be generated in the first place so that the capitalist could rob it from the worker. In other words, surplus theory of value only exists in a positive transaction, that is where a surplus value can be generated in the first place. Now,
Mr. Soy, I swear I don't mean this question as pejorative, but I truly have to ask. Don't take this the wrong way, and don't think I'm purely asking this to sound inflammatory, but what the fuck are you talking about? Literally no Marxist believes that surplus value always exists, and that we think it's created at the point of purchase because then there's an amount of money that the capitalist can siphon away from the worker. I'm unaware of what a positive transaction is, and you're starting to sound like Jordan Peterson in that you're just saying buzzwords for the sake of sounding academic instead of making a substantive point.
Correctly identifying those assumptions are crucially helpful in order to deconstruct their theory, because it simply cannot exist without them. For instance, if we were to deconstruct the third assumption, we can do so by a thought experiment, where the cost of labor is $50, the cost of materials is about $25, while the product that was sold is only $50. The surplus value is simply not present here.
Wow. I always knew ubersoy went down a dialogue tree of the most commonly used libertarian talking points against Marx, but I didn't think his arguments could be this dumb. In this instance, assuming the price at which the product is purchased is $50, the capitalist has set the cost of labor so high to the point where they're losing $25 each purchase and they're not producing surplus value. Are you of the belief that surplus value is produced in every instance of labor? Because in that case, you're in La La Land. Marx never said anything so inane.
We need to assume that the transaction will be positive for the capitalist in order for this to work. However,
The statement you just made is utterly delusional.
Will be to challenge the idea that you can objectively measure how much money a worker is owed by the capitalist.
You're saying words that don't mean anything! The price at which labor is set is determined by the capitalist so long as a person who's qualified is willing to fill the position in. Holy shit, this is the stupidest video arguing against leftism I've seen in months!
You can either start by discrediting worker hour wage, as it is a known fact that workers' productivity tends to decline with the amount of hours they work, as well as their quality of work tends to go up and down throughout the day. Or you can discredit the solutions that your opponent will propose, but in any event, your strongest weapon here is deconstructing their assumptions and appealing to subjectivity of measuring value that typically they would agree with if the conversation were to be about art or music, or even culture.
Yes, the same principle applies, although I don't know how I'd be able to purchase culture as a whole. Maybe an empanada, but the same principle of the LTV applies in all purchases. If I feel a product is adequate enough to where it will serve me a utility, I buy it according to the Marxist conception of how value is conceived.
Same is the case with the labor theory of value, as I would argue, and frankly, even if you assume that it is true and take it as it is, you can deduct ad absurdum the shit out of it by bringing an example of a marble statue one person had spent 50 hours making using pre-modern tools and another person using modern technology in just under 1 hour. And now ask yourself this question: does the former person get 50 times as much money as the latter person if we assume, of course, that 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 person who had spent 50 hours making it was not fired and the cost of materials are equal.
This is the case the mud pie argument makes part and parcel. It's a fallacious straw man which essentially boils the LTV down to effort exerted equals value created. But this is a fundamental misunderstanding of what value is in the Marxist sense, because value is determined by how a purchaser feels about the adequacy of labor. If we're assuming that the capitalist has set the price, then it doesn't matter how much work has been put into either of them, so long as someone is willing to purchase them. If someone is willing to purchase them, they feel that either 50 hours of labor for one of them and under an hour for another is adequate, to the point where they're paying the price either way, and once either one of the statues is sold, value is produced. For value to be created in the Marxist sense, a purchaser has to see utility in the product or service. Just let this intelligent Marxist lass explain it.
Has a capitalist ever told you, labor isn't a source of value because I can spend all day making mud pies, yet at the end of the day, no one would find them to be valuable? This argument reduces Marx's labor theory of value to effort exerted is value created. You see, the mud pie argument is a straw man. Anyone that uses it is either acting in ignorance or deception, as Marx covers this topic 7 pages into Volume 1 of Capital.
Quote, "Finally, nothing can be of value without being an object of utility. If the thing is useless, so is the labor contained in it. The labor does not count as labor and therefore creates no value." End quote.
Additionally, Marx said, for something to be a commodity, it must be transferred to another person for whom it serves as a use value through the medium of exchange. Therefore, mud pies, unless they develop a use value or demand for them arises, would not have an exchange value in the marketplace. The problem is that the vast majority of people who are most critical of Marx have never actually read his work. So we as Marxists are going to have to continue debunking this broken argument for the foreseeable future.
As you can see, this equation turns ridiculous if you challenge some of their assumptions or take it as it is and apply their logic to different scenarios. But if that is not enough, you can also appeal to their deepest psyche, which typically revolves around hating the capitalist as a class, and instead you can offer a better alternative to their resentment.
Since you're all about tapping into psyches, I could just exploit your hatred for rainbow flags and black people by offering you a better alternative to your resentment. Here it is.
Touch grass.
Just distinguishing between small and giant businesses and perhaps even red pilling them in the process. One funny thing I like to do in particular is saying that capitalists as a class are a phenomenon of a social construction that stopped being relevant last century, and instead we should focus on the super rich and improving the conditions of the workers.
The super rich are capitalists.
However, is to moralize this issue by justifying the unequal labor relations as a whole, where the capitalist can basically do whatever he wants to do, especially considering that your opponent is of the exact opposite moral framework. So it is logical that you won't be able to appeal to them in such a manner, as it is in my conviction that the defense of private property can be best defended not by the appeal of it being a right, which is circular, but rather by an appeal to its functionality, and it is often the case that the exercise of businesses by the capitalists must be heavily regulated in order to increase social functioning and decrease resentment and Marxist sentiments.
You said you were gonna make an argument in favor of private property, with the case being its functionality, but then you pivot to regulating private property to increase social functioning. However, we'd have much more increased social functioning if our labor was on a level playing field and we distributed the profits equally, with some exceptions being present in cases of need, right?
Moral statements about how a capitalist can do with you whatever he wants to do just because you signed a contract will build nothing but a greater resentment towards you and make you look like a bootlicker. Finally, if you like to troll, or possibly you are even a libertarian, what I like to bring up pretty often is known as Taylorism, or the scientific management. That is an idea that we can measure the wage of the worker by the productivity of the worker instead of their fixed hourly wage. And
we can measure their wages via their productivity and not their wage. Right, the utter brilliance of libertarianism, people. And no, you're wrong about this too, in that Taylorism is a wide variety variety of attempts to apply principles of engineering to productive capacity of labor, and it's in no way the LTV from a capitalist perspective. That would be the LTV because it was originally conceived of by Smith and Ricardo to one extent or another. The one libertarian idea I have to give credit to. That's like saying a human but of the species Homo sapiens. It refers to itself. I'd honestly love to see you make more videos fatuously attempting to criticize Marxism because seeing Darwinists like you taking L after L after L is amusing. Well folks, as you can see, ubersoy has not only failed to debunk a single premise that the LTV puts forth, but he's also lowered the collective IQ substantially and made himself look dumber than we already thought he was. If you'd like to debate in favor of ubersoy's position, or are ubersoy himself looking to debate, you know what to do. Thanks for watching.